Cool. Okay, lovely. It's great to see everybody from the west side of the Atlantic and the east side of the Atlantic. So this is as much as it's a workshop. So in some senses, it's going to turn into a little bit of a networking event towards the end, because we will be moving into breakout rooms. So if you could have your video on, that would be wonderful, because at some point you will be interacting with each other. So it's always nice to see the person at the other end, the voice that you're speaking to. So my name's Patrick McAndrew. I'm part of Digital Irish, and what we've got here today is a workshop on the supply and demand of attention. What we're going to be talking about is attention in itself. So attention is a mental resource. We use our attention for focus, but we use it for so many of the different roles that we use in our mind to do our work on a daily basis. All of us sitting here are using our computers and have to think deeply for the work that we do. And for that, we use a huge amount of attention. But the world that we live in craves a lot of our attention as well. And sometimes the hardest part is balancing those two competing forces, the attention that's trying to be taken from us and the attention that we're trying to channel for the work that we do. So over the workshop, the intention is that you'll get a greater understanding of what the value of your attention really is, and how you can channel it into your work by cutting out the things that are distracting you and are taking you away from the focused work that you really crave to do. So I'm going to move into just a little bit of a slideshow, which we're going to work through. This is going to be the presentation part. And after we get through that, then we're going to move into some breakout sessions where we can discuss what has been presented here today, so that we can kind of learn from each other and learn from each other's feedback of what we've taken from this. So I'm just going to open up just before we go into it. Can everybody see my screen? Thumbs up, everybody can see initial thoughts? Okay, wonderful. So before we get into this, I just want you, if you have a pen and paper beside you, just to write down your initial thoughts of what comes to mind when you think about attention. And this may seem like a slightly trivial question, but this is actually very helpful for you just to set the seed of how you think about this topic. So it could be something like, I don't know, I have a bad relationship with my attention, I have a great relationship with my attention, I use it very well, I don't. Whatever comes to mind, just take 20 seconds and write down what comes to mind when you think about attention. Okay, and with that, we're going to go in and we're going to just talk a little bit about what our attention is. So I've got this little fella here, this little character as our attention. And oftentimes our attention is a very hard thing to grasp. We understand time because we see it as a clock. And if we didn't have the clock to root our understanding of what time is, it would be very hard, apart from understanding that the sun rises and the sun falls. So to help us to ground ourselves in thinking of attention as something tangible, I want us to think about it like money. I want us to think about it as something that has supply and demand, something that we use as a transfer of value. And I want you to start to think about it that we begin each day with a fixed amount of money, and every time we use our attention, we are taking money from the supply that we have. So let's say, for example, we start off every day with $100. Every time we use our attention, we are taking something from that pile of $100. And eventually we'll get to zero. Some of us get to zero by 11 a.m. in the morning and we have no attention for the rest of the day. Some of us manage to save it and we get until bedtime, and then we have our attention that lasts us and sustains us for the whole day. And that's really what we're going to be talking about here, how we manage that supply and demand of attention. And the reason why it's so challenging today is because the demand for our attention today far exceeds the supply. So there's a fixed supply of attention that we have. Every time we go to bed, we wake up refreshed. We've got the capacity to channel our attention, make decisions, consume information. But as the day goes on, our supply of attention starts to wane. And ironically enough, as we go through our day, the demand for our attention increases drastically. So although we start out getting a few notifications from our phone, we start out checking the news, as we go through our day, more and more inputs of things are requiring us to consume information and make decisions. And that's going counter to actually the supply of our attention. And that's why sometimes we can arrive at 1 p.m. in the afternoon and a very simple response to an email can take us 25 or 30 minutes. We're wondering where our mind is, why it's so frazzled. And that's because we've really consumed the resource that we need to do that task. It's gone. And that's because oftentimes we don't realize the value of it. We don't understand how to control it. And the reason for this is because there's two very polarizing demands for our attention. So there's the external demand, which is the attention economy. We'll speak about that in a moment. That's the world that we live in today, where the huge amount of the major companies in the world drive their revenue streams off capturing our attention. They need our attention to capture our influence for us to make purchases. That's how their business system works. But then from an internal demand, all of us sitting in front of computers are required to think very deeply for our work for a living. We need to use our attention. Very few of us are following rote practices where we can brainlessly and aimlessly do our work. It doesn't happen anymore. We have to think very abstract, and we have to constantly solve problems and come up with new solutions to just very simple demands that are made of us. So let's just think about our attention as a resource and understand what it fuels. And to apply it to a physical sort of demand, all of us have some level of a stamina. So if we wanted to go out for a run, we could go out for a run. Now, some of us can run for a mile, some of us can run for 26 miles. We still have that ability to run. We still have that stamina. But if we actually wanted to grow that stamina and maybe do a marathon, then we have to train. We have to practice and pursue endurance so that we can stretch that out. So the endurance part of it is the skill, which you train yourself in, but the stamina is a natural ability. And if we think about attention in the same way, attention is a natural ability that all of us have. It's a resource that we all have access to, but we need it to fuel the different skills that we try to get better at for everyday lives. So one of those is initiative. So taking initiative in a task, having to actually come forward and begin something. Oftentimes people today speak a lot about procrastination, the inability to actually get started on something. Because when they arrive at that moment, their attention is very fragmented. It's in many different directions that they struggle to just channel it into one thing. And that's why they struggle to take initiative. Similarly, when we talk about focus and attention are spoken of hand in hand, but focus is a skill. Focus is the endurance and the stamina that you develop to do a marathon, but you have the natural ability, the natural stamina, which you can grow from. And that's our attention. So focus is not something that you just turn to straight away. It's a skill which you develop, but to utilize that skill, you have to first of all understand your attention and manage your attention, which is what we're going to speak about here today. And then managing yourself. You know, we all arrive at 2 p.m. in the afternoon or 5 p.m. in the evening, and we find ourselves doing things which we typically wouldn't do. We start off with the intention that we're not going to eat certain foods, and 2 p.m. comes around and we relent and we give in. Or where we plan that we're going to exercise later on in the evening, and 5 p.m. comes around and we decide that the couch looks a bit more appealing and Netflix is an easier activity. And then we wonder why. And that's because our willpower is decreased. And that's because our attention is low because we've used it all. It's all connected. It's not a thing that's separated. They're all feeding off the one resource, which is our attention. Similarly, planning and goal setting, the capacity to actually think forward and think ahead of things that you need to do. These require huge amounts of deep thinking and time so that you can just commit to that aspect of attention. Thinking about the things that will go well and the things that will go wrong, how you can preordain the things that you need to plan for. We need to be honest with ourselves and realize that that's a resource that we need to pull from. And finally, learning. Today, we consume so much information. We are constantly consuming and processing information. But I've spoken with lots of people. This is how I got onto this track of work, because I was helping people with speed reading and memorization. And I realized that that's not the thing that people need the help with. They need the help with attention and focus, because their ability to actually process and retain information is something that they struggle with so deeply. From oncologists at Sloan Kettering, to MBA graduates at Columbia University, to executive management teams at Fortune 500 companies, to even just kids in public schools. I've seen it all. It's the same problems no matter where you exist. No level of education gives you an understanding of your attention, because none of us really have taken the time to understand it, because neuroscience has only really come to understand what our attention is in the last 5 or 6 years, which is why the science hasn't necessarily transcended into the business world. And that's what we're trying to do today, to try and disseminate it and make it a little bit easier. So those 5 skills that I laid out there were 5 really simple skills that we all use every day. But what we're becoming aware of is that these thought and thinking skills are going to become in more and more demand as we evolve and go into different sets of economies. So the World Economic Forum put forward the 2022 skills outlook of the skills that are going to be declining and the skills that are going to be growing. And the ones that are declining are the rote, repetitive skills which you do over and over again. The ones that are growing are the abstract reasoning skills and critical thinking skills which we need to engage in. And some of these, as an example, are analytical thinking and innovation, active learning and learning strategies, critical thinking and analysis, complex problem solving. All of these skills are going to be growing more and more. And as we can see in the lives that we're living today, we need to be continuous learners. The degree that we get from university doesn't sustain us for the rest of our careers anymore. We have to be very adaptive in how we grow and approach our work. And that's been quite a dramatic shift, where we were used to be very cubicled workers that evolved from the Industrial Revolution. Now we are living in the information age, and it's completely different. It changes every day. So your capacity to utilize your brain and actually commit to these very time-draining skills is hugely important. But the great challenge of this is that we're all competing with the attention economy. And oftentimes this is what we succumb to. We succumb to the demands for our attention, which we don't take control of. And remember when we spoke about how there's a lot of attention scarcity? Well, this scarcity is what people pay a lot of money for. This is where the ad revenue goes. This is where the algorithms are developed to capture our attention. This is where people try and build social media platforms based off slot machines and casinos. There's a reason for this, because we need to be engaged in these platforms for a network effect. They need us to arrive into the app and the platform, and they need us to stay there. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, we can't fault these businesses for it, but it's helpful if we can be aware of how it's crippling our attention. So we live in the attention economy, and we're very well of these four companies. They're known as the four because they're probably the most prevalent of all tech companies. And they've become so prevalent in our lives that they've kind of taken over our body parts. Where Google has become our brain, when we have a question or a quarrel, we turn to Google. We look to it for an answer, and it gives us some advice. Or if we need to learn how to do something, one of its companies, YouTube, will teach us. We'll watch a video, and it will show us how we do the task. If we need some empathy or some social engagement, we'll turn to Facebook. We'll use Facebook to interact with people, to share a thought, to share a feeling. We'll either do it through Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, all under the same heading of the same parent company. Then for our consumption, how we actually consume material things, because we are all driven in this modern world to be consumers. We strive to succeed so that we consume a little bit more. It's a natural tendency today. And Amazon clearly feeds that need. We get onto their platform, not alone do they give us what we desire, but they give us more. They suggest other things that we can go for. And if you're hungry, as I was as I always am, but living in New York, I had Whole Foods around the corner, another Amazon company that I could turn to feed those needs. And they interact with you in that. That's their mission, that's their motto, that's how they're designed. And Apple is how we show our attractiveness. That's how we show our value in society. In the past, there were many different things that you would do to show where you stood in society based on the color of the clothing that you wore, the color of your hair, or some of the jewelry that you would wear. And that corresponded between males and females. Today, we don't have as peculiar methods of showing our value in society as we did for the past 1,000 years. But what we do have is we have Apple, which is a product by just having AirPods, an iPhone, an Apple Watch, or a laptop that shows who we are and who we identify with. And we all know that. We know that by purchasing this product, we're trying to tell people who we are. And we're trying to say that we're not one of those PC people. And that's been done intentionally. That's how they position themselves. They've done that very well. But all of these platforms need us to re-engage with their product. They need us to get into it. And then they hold us captive with the network effect. And, you know, there's no problem with that, because we also rely on our lives for these products. But are we held captive to them, or are we in control of our attention? Because their revenue streams live off our attention, yet our value to society and our value to our work lives off how we channel our own attention for our own work. So there's huge polarizing demands there. But what we're going to talk about today is all wrapped up in this, and it is the two hidden consumers of our attention. So the two hidden consumers of our attention are information and decisions. And I've spoken a bit So before I go into talk a little bit more, we're going to do something that is unconventional, and we're going to take a little brain break. So this is something that I do in my workshops because a lot of the time when we work, we're so focused or engaged in the screen in front of us, and we're so busy thinking in our heads that we need to come out of our heads for a few minutes and into our body. Oftentimes when we try and take a break from the screen that we're looking at, we turn to another screen and we use that as a break. But that doesn't really help us because it just fragments our attention even more. So what we're going to do is something where we're going to use our hands to get out of our head and into our body. And I'm just going to ask all of you, your mics are muted, so nobody's going to be hearing you, but just to get your thumbs in front of you like this. So just if you can clasp your fingers around each other and just get your thumbs in front of you. And you're going to move your right thumb clockwise. So you can watch your thumb, it's going to move clockwise. And then you're going to move your left thumb clockwise. So we've tried both of those. And now we're going to move the two thumbs together, but they have to meet at the central point together. So just here, so we're going to go like that. And you have to count every time they meet. And you want to focus so that they meet at the same time. And we're going to count to 15. So we'll do that together just for 15 seconds. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. It's not easy, right? It's kind of hard. But what it does is it takes you out of your head and into your body. And you can do that for 60 seconds. And the reason why that's so effective is for most of us, when we sit at a screen all day, even just after looking at a screen for 30 minutes, we appoint a moment of boredom. And in that moment of boredom, we seek out some other stimulus. And when we're living there, we're living in a part of our brain that is deeply stressed. So we're not even able to access the part of our brain, which is the front of our brain, that we need to live in. We're living in the back of our brain. And when we go and we look at a social media platform or our email, we only reinforce the stress that we're living in. And sometimes we can spend the whole day living in this state of stress, which is why things take us so long. But just taking this little brain break for 15, 30, 60 seconds opens your brain up so that you're using the left and right side of your hemisphere and you're coming out of your head and into your body. So this helps. So now we can move on because we've just cleared our head a little bit, and we're going to move on to the next section. And we're going to talk about information. So the level of information that we have to deal with. Now, there was a study done in 2011 that proved that we now consume 5 times more information than we did in 1986. And that's the equivalent to 174 newspapers worth of information a day. So 174 newspapers worth of information we take in every day as information. And it's probably a lot more than that today because that study was done 9 years ago. We don't have the capacity to take in that much information. We have limitations in our brain. So we're completely overwhelmed most of the day, which is why we arrive at that state of overwhelm. And the impact of taking in that much attention is triggered through what's known as attention residue and overstimulation. So to explain what attention residue is, I want you to think about your brain as rooms in a home. So every time you go in and you do a different task, you're turning on a different light in the home. And if you go in and look at your email, it's like turning onto your living room and turning on that light. And then you look at that email and you think, that's a bit of a tricky one to get back to. I'll get back to that in a little bit. I'll have a look at the news first. I'll move away from that difficult task. So you go and you look at the news. Now, although you've shifted your attention from that email to the news, and the front of your brain is cognizant and aware of the news, the back of your mind is still processing that email. It's still thinking about how you're going to respond to it. And then you've looked at the headlines. Let's be honest, most of us don't even read a full article. So we've skimmed the headlines, maybe the first 2 or 3 paragraphs. After we've got that hit of dopamine, we want something more. So we move on to social media. We've got 3 or 4 apps or platforms. Mindlessly, we switch from one to the other to the next. And now we've moved away from our email and the news, and we're on a couple of social media platforms. And now we've got 3 different rooms where our attention is still focused in our mind. And then we move off that because we got a notification on Slack that somebody got in touch with us, and we shift over to Slack. Now we've got 4 different rooms in our mind where these lights are lit up. And then we go back to our email to respond to it. And we're shocked at why it takes us so long. Why that simple email, which we've given ourselves time to think about, it takes us 20 or 30 minutes. And that's because our attention is completely fragmented. And what's surprising is that every time we take these breaks, it takes us on average 23 minutes and 15 seconds to realign our attention back to it. So if you've been trying to write a paper or an article or just respond to an email and you open up your phone and look at a message, you're not looking away for 10 or 15 seconds, you're looking away for an average 23 minutes, which is why we only spend minutes working rather than days. We might spend days in front of the computer, but we only spend minutes working. Because the average person checks their email 77 times per day, usually on average of 10 to 20 seconds at a time. They're only looking at it for a sense of release, not really something to engage with. And that's why we all feel this way. We feel like our mind is so fragmented that it may take so long to make some sense of progress because our attention is splayed over so many different things. We've got so many rooms with lights on in our brain that's why by the time we come to 11 a.m., we're toast. We're done. It's totally natural. And once we understand that this is the way our attention works, we can actually start to change it. Because nobody's taught us this. We've just been given the platforms to engage with. We've been told that it's more convenient, that we have more choice, more freedom, but we haven't understood what the opportunity cost is. That by getting more choice and more opportunity, by getting more surface area and more things to engage with, we're actually limiting the resource that we need the most. And this constant engagement makes us extremely overstimulated, which makes it difficult for us to focus for even just 10 minutes. So if you can imagine, you're constantly engaged. So how can you just stay focused for longer than 10 minutes? Because you're so used to this dopamine hit. And I've got a little video here to share why this happens and what's going on in our brain.
And it can be hard to put your phone down. Take for example the game Candy Crush. As you play the game, you achieve small goals, causing your brain to be rewarded with little bursts of dopamine, and eventually you're rewarded in the game with new content. This novelty also gives little bursts of dopamine and together create what is known as a compulsion loop, which just happens to be the same loop responsible for the behaviors associated with nicotine or cocaine. Our brains are hardwired to make us novelty seeking, and this is why apps on our phones are designed to constantly provide us with new content, making them hard to put down.
So what we're actually seeking is not the thing at the end. So we're not actually seeking to see something specific on social media. We're not actually seeking a particular email. Our brains are hardwired to seek the anticipation that there might be something new there. That's what they desire. And just even the anticipation that something might lie within our inbox to look at it is enough. We could look at our email and there could be no new emails, but just the anticipation that there's something there gives us that dopamine hit. And that's what keeps us coming back. And that's why you need to be so aware of when you allow yourself, because I know it myself, I used to go through this cycle. If I ever came off course and I would open up LinkedIn, for example, just as a moment's distraction, I would find myself going up these 5 different websites. I think it was like joe.ie, sportsjoe.ie. I didn't even care what content was on it. I wasn't even looking. But my brain would mindlessly go from LinkedIn to Joe, to Sports Joe, to The Guardian, to Facebook. And that would be the sequence that I would do. It was like a lap. And then after 20 minutes, I'd come back to the work. And that's because our brain is hardwired to feed this compulsion loop, this anticipation that something is going to be on the other end. So once we're aware of that, we can start to take control of it. Becoming aware of it is the best part. And Herb Simon, who was an economist and a social psychologist in the late 70s, left this quote: "What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." And I've seen that because when I was teaching workshops on speed reading, people wanted to be able to process information faster. They wanted to be able to process more information. But what they didn't realize, and what I didn't even realize at the time, is that we're processing too much information already. We need to do less. We need to reduce the stimulation so that we have more consistent attention throughout the day. And this is what has led to what I've come to realize as the fractured mind. So it begins with starting off your day with an overwhelming amount of information, where you look at your phone. Most of us wake up to the alarm from our phone. And as we look at our phone to wake up, we've got a stream of notifications awaiting us. So we already begin our day looking at the news, looking at Twitter, looking at our email, looking at Facebook. We are already living off the stimulant. And as we've learned about the compulsion loop, it's like a cocaine addict starting their day off with a line of cocaine. You're going to stay doing lines of cocaine for the rest of the day. It's not like you're going to start with one line of cocaine and say, okay, I'll leave it and I'll come back to it at dinner time. You're going to stay going. And it's no different in the way that the brain is hardwired. So that desire that stimulation to start your day off that way sustains itself throughout the day. The minute your phone comes off airplane mode, if you do put your phone in airplane mode when you go to bed, you're hooked. That's it. You're in it for the day. Because it's very hard once you've fed your brain that level of stimulation to take yourself away from it. So we begin by being overwhelmed, and then we arrive at our work after all that stimulation, and we try and focus. But we find that our attention is extremely broken, and things are taking us much longer than we intended. We had 5 goals which we wanted to achieve for the day, but we end up just getting 2 done. And we get extremely frustrated with ourselves, and we start to judge ourselves, and we start to question why it takes us so long. And that leads us down this cycle of self-judgment. And then to avoid that cycle of self-judgment, we turn to social media, we turn to our email to get out of that cycle of internal dialogue. And then we go back into the cycle of overwhelming ourselves with the information, returning to work, broken attention, self-judgment, and it just persists. And at the end of the day, we say to ourselves, I'm not going to let myself be like that tomorrow. I'm going to be better. I'm going to be more focused. I'm going to get more done. But we wake up looking at our phone and it starts all over again. And we're all living through this cycle. We, you know, as I said, I saw it from high school students in public schools in Pennsylvania to executive management teams at Fortune 500 companies to students that were paying like 120 grand a year to get MBAs. They were all saying, how can I focus? I can't study. I can't get any of it done. So it's not something that we have to be ashamed of, because it's strife. It's rife, I mean to say, within society today. And the second part is decisions. So we make so many decisions every day, and we're not even aware of it. We love choice. This is just the standard menu at Starbucks. And I thought about this because when my mum first went to New York when we were kids, we were so excited to hear what New York was all about. And we said to her, you know, what was it like in New York? And one of the first stories that she told us is she said, I couldn't get a black coffee. And we were like, what? We want to hear about the buildings. We want to hear about everything else. She said, I couldn't get a black coffee. I got in off a red eye. I had to go straight to a meeting, and I went to Starbucks and I said, can you give me a coffee? And then they said, well, do you want a hot coffee or an iced coffee? And she said, I'll take a hot coffee. And then they said, well, do you want a brewed coffee or an Americano? She said, I'll have a brewed coffee. And then they said, well, do you want a medium roast, a light roast, or a dark roast? And she said, what's that? And they had to explain it to her. And she said, I'll take a medium roast. And then they said, well, do you want a tall, a grande, or a venti? And she had no idea what that was. And they had to explain that to her. And she said she came out of that feeling like she needed 3 coffees because they had just taken so much of her energy to make all those decisions. Yet we have kind of programmed ourselves to think, well, this is great. Like, this amount of choice is wonderful. We are free. We have so much to choose from. And Barry Schwartz wrote a book in 2004 and made a TED Talk in 2006 called The Paradox of Choice. And I'm just going to play you a small little clip from that just to get an idea of where we are in society today.
I want to start with what I call the official dogma. The official dogma of what? The official dogma of all Western industrial societies. And the official dogma runs like this. If we are interested in maximizing the welfare of our citizens, the way to do that is to maximize individual freedom. The reason for this is both that freedom is in and of itself good, valuable, worthwhile, essential to being human, and because if people have freedom, then each of us can act on our own to do the things that will maximize our welfare, and no one has to decide on our behalf. The way to maximize freedom is to maximize choice. The more choice people have, the more freedom they have, and the more freedom they have, the more welfare they have. This, I think, is so deeply embedded in the water supply that it wouldn't occur to anyone to question it. And it's also deeply embedded in our lives. I'll give you some examples of what modern progress has made possible for us. This is my supermarket, not such a big one. I want to say just a word about salad dressing. 175 salad dressings in my supermarket. If you don't count the 10 extra virgin olive oils and 12 balsamic vinegars you could buy to make a very large number of your own salad dressings in the off chance that none of the 175 the store has on offer suits you. So this is what the supermarket is like. And then you go to the consumer electronics store to set up a stereo system, speakers, CD player, tape player, tuner, amplifier, and in this one single consumer electronics store, there are that many stereo systems. We can construct 6.5 million different stereo systems out of the components that are on offer in one store. You got to admit that's a lot of choice. In other domains, the world of communications, there was a time when I was a boy when you could get any kind of telephone service you wanted as long as it came from Ma Bell. You rented your phone, you didn't buy it. One consequence of that, by the way, is that the phone never broke. And those days are gone. We now have an almost unlimited variety of phones, especially in the world of cell phones. These are cell phones of the future. My favorite is the middle one, the MP3 player, nose hair trimmer, and creme brulee torch. And if by some chance you haven't seen that in your store yet, you can rest assured that one day soon you will. And what this does is it leads people to walk into their stores asking this question. And do you know what the answer to this question now is? The answer is no. It is not.
And the thing is, we don't ask that question anymore because we've come to accept that our phones can do an infinite amount of things, and we want it to do an infinite amount of things. We request it to. But what this has done is this way of looking at the world, and this is what comes with becoming a more wealthy society, is that we cherish having more choice, but there is an opportunity cost to that. So by having more choice, you have to make more decisions. And when you have more choice and make more decisions, oftentimes we don't look at the decisions that we make. Are they trivial or are they valuable? And decisions play a huge weight on our attention because our brains really struggle to balance two concepts. Moving between two different lines of thought to think, is this valuable or that valuable, really struggles for us because we're balancing two competing different ideas. We're trying to value them against each other, and that becomes extremely hard. But the decision-making that we have made extends just outside of choice because we've switched a lot of the tasks from convenience to choice. So a lot of companies that were established to provide convenience now are established to provide choice. They've changed the model. Where in the past you had travel agents. So if you wanted to go and travel somewhere, you would arrive at a desk or you would call somebody up and you would say, I want to go to Spain for 2 weeks at the end of August. I'm looking to stay in this kind of a place in this part of Spain. Please help me out and come back to me with some options. You'd get 3 or 4 options and you'd make a purchase based on that. Today, those industries have been broken. Look, it's brought a lot of efficiency, it's brought some convenience, but it's brought a huge amount of choice to us. We're just simply going abroad, which none of us are doing right now, but when the time comes around to do it again, we have a huge number of decisions to make. First of all, we have an abundance of choices to where we want to go. Then once we choose where we actually want to go, we go and look at Airbnb or hotels.com. We've nearly got to understand the layout of the city before we even get there because we have to become experts to understand where we want to stay. What's the kind of town that we want to be in? What's the kind of neighborhood that we like? Then once we get there, we have to look at Skyscanner. Do we need to get connecting flights or just direct flights? What's the difference? What happens if we take a connecting flight? And all of this extends into many, many different types of industries. Chipotle came along in the mid-90s and they created what's known as the fast casual model. We see that today where when you go into a restaurant, you go up to a counter, they've got the food laid out, and you choose the different items that you want. Now, most of us eat in these restaurants for lunchtime, and we don't realize that although we're leaving for lunch and we want to take a break from making decisions and thinking, we're doing more thinking and making more decisions when we actually step into these restaurants. Because we actually have to craft our whole meal. We have to decide, do we want a burrito or a bowl? Do we want pork or do we want chicken or do we want carnitas? What goes inside of it? Am I actually going to get guacamole? Will I get a little bit of sour cream? Do I want to get some nachos on the side? You have to make all of these decisions because they're made available to us as choice. And most of the restaurants that we see today are taking this model. And although it seems wonderful because we get to craft our own meal, what we don't realize is that, once again, there's an opportunity cost that when we go back, our decisions are depleted, our attention is depleted. We only have a finite supply of attention and decisions which we can make every day. And most of us have them, we've used it all before we even get to the work that's most necessary. And the same is how accessible we need to be. You know, these are very conventional apps, which most of us have on our phone. I'm sure we have even more than this of how we're accessible to people. Back in the day, we were available through text and calls. And when I keep saying back in the day, I'm not saying that we need to return to an old way of living. But the point that I'm making is that just because these platforms and ways of living have become available to us does not necessarily mean that they're the best options or the best alternatives. Your attention is the most valuable resource that you have, without a doubt, today. It's way more valuable than time, because time is nothing without the mental capacity to actually do something within that time frame. And oftentimes we give our attention too freely to things that seem appealing in this very moment in time, rather than understanding how we can actually save our attention and use it to more worthwhile practices. And this overwhelming amount of decisions cause decision fatigue. And with decision fatigue, you get dramatically reduced willpower and you make poor decisions. They've seen what happens in court scenarios where judges will often grant bail to people that are arriving in the court under much more questionable circumstances when they approach lunchtime than they do in the morning. Because they've made multiple decisions up to that point and they haven't eaten any food yet, they're more likely to make erratic decisions on who will get bail. And we can track this in many, many, many different circumstances. There's a reason why people who work in air traffic control stations typically take a break every 90 minutes. They step away from the work because it's a very mentally demanding work. But we must be honest with ourselves. For all of us that sit in front of a computer, this is extremely mentally demanding work. We have never worked like this before, yet we have just all kind of rolled into one way of working, which expects that we just take and take and take from our own attention and our energy. But we need to learn how to manage it and not necessarily give it to everything that's coming our way. Another thing is focus. We're very aware of that without your attention, and by making huge amounts of decisions and consuming a lot of attention, it dramatically reduces your focus. And in line with that, reduces productivity. But probably most importantly, it reduces your happiness, because when you're not actually able to do the work that you want, you become unhappy with yourself. You judge yourself, you reduce your self-value, you question your ability. And these are all inherent skills that we have, but we've just unfortunately never been taught how to utilize them. And they're the most important skills that we can use, because once you understand how to manage your attention and your focus, it applies to everything that you do, whether it's learning a new skill or trying to take on a new challenge or engaging in something that requires some level of endurance. It applies to everything. It's not single. It runs across all streams of our life. And the way that we can do this, some small steps, is to start to apply some routine to the decisions that we make. So we remove the amount of decisions that we make every day. And this can be done by having the same breakfast every day. It can be done by picking out your clothes the night before. It can be done by planning your exercise and the times that you're going to exercise at the beginning of the week so that it doesn't arrive. And most importantly, planning what you're going to do today for tomorrow. Just simply arriving at your desk today and deciding, well, what's my to-do list? You've drained so much from yourself before you even got into it. And oftentimes you will imbalance the priorities. Whereas if you can do it the night before and just lay out 4 or 5 items that need to be done tomorrow, then you arrive at your desk and you can just get right into it. But oftentimes we jam pack our mornings with loads of decisions so that by the time we sit down, we're fatigued and we've reached that decision fatigue. But if you really want to take it a step further and you want to go all in, then you can just start dressing like Steve Jobs did for 20 years and you can just wear the same set of clothes. And, that's pretty easy. And you can definitely do that during the coronavirus because nobody's going to see you in a different outfit. So that's an alternative for this moment in time. And simply by making less decisions, you make better decisions. And by conserving that energy, you will essentially use better mental skills, better willpower. You'll have more focus, more productivity, and just be aware of the amount of choice that is available to you and how you engage with the amount of choice. Because oftentimes we're, as Barry Schwartz said, it's so deeply embedded in society that we crave choice. But what we've learned is that once you go over just 3 items of choice, the brain starts to get overwhelmed. It can't process more than that. So just be aware of that once you're giving yourself more than 3 elements of choice, it's too much. You need to reduce that down because we can handle those 3 items. But once we get beyond that, that's when our brain really starts to get overwhelmed and into overdrive. And simply to think about it, your attention is a commodity of extreme value. It's something that we have every day and we can decide how much we give of it in the world that we interact with. And you could choose where you want to spend it. If you want to spend it in the attention economy or in thinking for a living. So at the end of all this, the most important part is that we get to connect and reflect on what's being shared here. I've shared my message, but I want you to be able to engage with each other, because we know from neuroscience that the process of consuming information is just the first step of learning. The next step is to connect on what you've learned with and to reflect on it. If you don't do that, oftentimes only 2% of what you consume sticks. So just by having this dialogue and engaging with each other, it allows you to think in different ways about what we've talked about today. And the two questions that I have that we're going to discuss in the breakout rooms is, what was surprising and what do you know now that you didn't know before? So I'm just going to give us 7 minutes. We're going to move into breakout rooms. And those are the two questions. What was surprising and what do you know now that you didn't know before? So for anybody who doesn't know, in the breakout rooms, you go into a small section of a group with people. If you can have your video turned on, it's a huge help, because then the people on the other in the group will be able to see you. Great stuff. So we're all back in. So I hope you had some interesting conversations and had an opportunity to learn from each other just in the conversations that you had there. And I would love if you could share in 3 or 4 words just in the chat bar what you shared, what was surprising and what you know now that you didn't know before, because then we can share it with the broader group and everybody can get a chance to see from each other's perspectives. Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing that. And there's more and more coming in. So it's always so helpful to see how everybody takes something different from this. And that's why it's so helpful to have these discussions at the end, because everybody will take their own takeaway from it. And then it helps to see why people took another perspective, and it helps broaden your awareness of it. So if you are hosting any events, it's always helpful just to include these things at the end, because you get a broader perspective from everybody in the audience. And just to share with you before we part, this is all part of a larger series that I have been running, and it's all part of the Momentum Mind series. So it is an online workshop for individuals, and it's also we're also doing corporate workshops for businesses. So if it's something that would be of interest to your company, the company that you work at, or something that you would be interested in sharing amongst your employees, I'm happy to chat with you about that. And just to share with you a little bit about the Momentum Mind series, what it is, we talked about the fractured mind. So this cycle of feeling overwhelmed and having broken attention and going into that cycle of self-judgment. It's extremely hard often to break out of that cycle. And to do so, we've developed the Momentum Mind program as a sprint. It's a 3-week sprint where we get a collective of business leaders in it, a small cohort, so that they can go through it with each other, learn from each other, be part of the program where you're consuming online content and applying it to your life, and then joining virtual calls where we're discussing what we've taken from it and learned. And the process of the Momentum Mind program is to start to understand how you can manage your attention. I hope you've seen today that your attention is a commodity. It's the most valuable resource that you have. And once you've understood that and you can really manage your attention, you can start to build sustained focus. So you can start to use practices similar to what we've discussed with the brain breaks and other elements to actually strengthen your focus. And from that, we go to mastery mindset, where it's understanding how your brain learns. So much of how we've been taught how to learn in school is very rudimentary for the kind of things that we need to do today. We try and learn things much faster, and we need to learn them much faster with much less information. So by going through the mastery mindset, you can apply this learning practice to a task, to a skill, to something you need to do for work, for anything you want to apply. These are kind of foundational things that apply to all elements of your life. And it's a 3-week workshop, as I mentioned. There's an application for entry. I'll share the link to go into the application in the chat bar in a moment. And the next workshop begins on the 12th of June. So if you're interested, you can schedule a call and we'll have a chat about it and see if we can get you into the next workshop, which begins on the 12th of June. And outside of that, I want to say a huge thank you. Thank you for spending your time here. Thank you for committing your attention to one single task and staying engaged in this. And if you want more details on this type of topic, you can check it out on thebowerycommon.com, or you can get in touch with me at info@thebowerycommon.com. And I'm just going to share a link with you in the chat bar, and we can share it in an email, which is going to go out afterwards as well. And from there, what we'll do is I'll share it in an email afterwards, because there's a lot of messages coming in. So thank you very much for the messages, guys. And we'll share an email afterwards with a link where I'd love to get your feedback on what you thought about this program, anything else that you'd like to know about. And if you're interested in scheduling a call for the Momentum Mind, I'd be happy to chat with you then as well. So I hope you have a great week. I hope you've taken something from this. Thank you for your time. And just to let you know, the Digital Irish as a whole, we've got a new podcast episode coming out on Monday. It's going to be with Mary McKenna. And you can check that out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. She's got an amazing story of where she came from, kind of, you know, a lot of different careers, moving into becoming an accountant to eventually founding her own startup, and now doing incredible work with helping startups throughout the world. And indeed, then we've got another event with her on June 2nd. And you can find more details of that on our website, where Mary Ann and I will be speaking with Mary McKenna, and also we're going to have some startups which are going to be speaking as well. So thank you very much for engaging with this, and hopefully we'll see you at the next Digital Irish event.